Midnight on the Central European frontier was never quiet. Even in periods of uneasy peace, the line dividing the Warsaw Pact and NATO carried a tension that felt physical, as if the soil itself remembered past invasions and waited for the next. To Soviet armored crews stationed along this boundary in the late 1970s and early 80s, darkness was not a disadvantage. It was a doctrine. For decades, Soviet operational planners had built their strategy on the idea that night operations leveled the technological playing field, masking massed formations and overwhelming NATO's thinner defensive lines. Inside their tanks, the familiar routines were almost comforting. Drivers traced terrain by memory and instrument light. Gunners prepared the active infrared lamps that generations of manuals had promised would give them sight when the battlefield became pitch black. Commanders rehearsed the choreography of rapid nighttime assaults, convinced that no Western crew could match their mobility under low visibility. Even the political officers emphasized this point in their briefings. The night belonged to Soviet armor. But along select nodes of the NATO line, a quiet shift had begun. American armored battalions had fielded a new modification of their long-serving M60 tank, an upgrade that did not change the silhouette, the armor scheme, or the engine note. At a distance, even a trained observer would have mistaken it for nothing more than another aging platform, a machine nearing the end of its life cycle. Yet inside the turret was an optical instrument unlike anything the Warsaw Pact expected to face. It was not a brighter lamp, not a stronger spotlight, and not an intensified starlight tube. It was something fundamentally different. When the first Soviet crews encountered this capability during routine border overwatch and training maneuvers, they did not understand what they were seeing, or more accurately, what was seeing them. In the darkness where they expected parity, they felt a subtle change. They noticed that NATO turrets reacted too quickly, tracking movements that should have been invisible. They sensed precision that contradicted every assumption built into their curriculum. Some commanders initially dismissed it as coincidence, others as NATO bluffing, but the pattern persisted. A belief that had shaped an entire generation of tactics was starting to crack, though few yet understood why. What seemed like routine night patrols were the first hints of a deeper shift that would soon unravel decades of confidence. In the months that followed those first uneasy encounters, Soviet tank commanders began filing reports that were difficult to categorize. None described direct engagements, and none suggested open conflict. Instead, they focused on a series of anomalies that defied the expectations drilled into every armored crew from the Baltic to the Balkans. Patrol leaders noted that when their units maneuvered under cover of darkness, NATO tanks reacted with uncanny precision. Turrets on distant ridgelines rotated toward them the moment they crested a hill. Hulls shifted position as if shadowing their movements. Even during exercises conducted in heavy fog or low cloud, conditions that traditionally degraded visibility to near zero, NATO armor seemed to retain a level of awareness that contradicted physics as Soviet crews understood it. The first theory was espionage. If NATO seemed to anticipate movements, perhaps someone was leaking unit schedules. But the anomalies persisted even during snap drills that had no advanced planning. The second theory was radar. Yet the electromagnetic environment along the frontier was constantly monitored, and no unusual emissions were detected. Moreover, the M60 was not known to carry a ground search radar system capable of tracking armor at tactical ranges. That explanation collapsed almost immediately. A few officers suggested that NATO had improved its passive light amplification devices. But even the best second-generation image intensifiers of the era struggled in the heavy moisture of Central European winters. Starlight could be amplified, but it could not be conjured out of existence when cloud cover swallowed the sky. What Soviet crews observed went beyond enhanced optics. It was as if NATO armor operated on a different sensory layer, one unaffected by the constraints of natural illumination. Word spread through armored regiments, often unofficially, passed between crews during maintenance halts or over tin cups of tea in field barracks. A pattern emerged. Whenever Soviet units relied on their active infrared searchlights, beams invisible to the naked eye but essential for night driving and gunnery, NATO tanks responded almost instantly. As soon as a lamp flicked on, distant silhouettes shifted. Turret aligned. A gun tube settled. It was not hostile, merely precise. Too precise. These moments accumulated, each small on its own but collectively unsettling. The doctrine that promised night as an ally was becoming unreliable. Crews began hesitating before activating their infrared lamps, unsure whether the invisible light was providing an advantage or signaling their location like a beacon. A question began forming at battalion headquarters and divisional staff meetings. What exactly were the Americans seeing? By the early 1980s, the puzzle had reached the desks of Soviet technical officers who specialized in armored sensor integration. Their task was to study every known NATO optical system, chart its performance envelope, and identify vulnerabilities. The M60's traditional sighting equipment was familiar: daylight telescopes, simple image intensifiers, and rangefinders that mirrored Soviet capabilities. Nothing in those catalogs explained the borderline preternatural awareness their crews were displaying at night. What unsettled analysts most were the after-action notes from Soviet reconnaissance units. These teams operated lighter vehicles with broader sensor packages and tended to be more observant about unusual activity. Multiple reports described a faint mechanical sound emanating from some American tanks when they were stationary in cold weather. It wasn't the rumble of a diesel power pack or the whine of a turret traverse system. It was something finer, higher, as if a small motor was spinning up inside an enclosed compartment. No known NATO sighting device required such a mechanism. The detail would have been easy to dismiss as crew misinterpretation, but the reports were consistent across units that never interacted. Technical officers dug deeper. They reviewed Western open-source literature, patent filings, and scientific journals, hunting for anything that might match the anomalies observed in the field. Buried in a handful of civilian research papers, they found references to experimental imaging devices that operated not by amplifying visible or near-infrared light, but by detecting the long-wave radiation emitted naturally by warm objects. These systems, referred to in scientific circles as thermal imagers, required cooling elements to function properly, which could explain the faint tonal vibration crews had described. But the technology was supposed to be far too immature for fielding. Laboratory prototypes were fragile, power-hungry, and sensitive to vibration. Mounting such a device inside a tank, a steel shell that shook violently whenever it traversed rough ground, seemed impossible. Even if such a system could survive the punishment of armored maneuver, its resolution was assumed to be crude. The thermal cameras available for industrial inspection produced ghostly silhouettes, not the finely detailed imagery needed for precision gunnery. Yet the intelligence contradictions mounted. NATO armor behaved as if it saw more clearly in darkness than it did in daylight. Soviet tactical schools had no framework for this possibility because it contradicted decades of operational logic. Night was supposed to neutralize the advantage of Western fire control systems, not magnify it. As the pattern became unmistakable, a realization began to take shape within certain branches of the Soviet armored directorates. If an American tank truly possessed a reliable thermal sight, then the Warsaw Pact's entire night-fighting doctrine was at risk of collapse. The first internal reviews within Soviet armored commands focused on whether such a capability could realistically alter outcomes on the battlefield. Analysts built models estimating engagement ranges, reaction times, and target identification probabilities during night operations. Soviet doctrine depended heavily on massed formations advancing under reduced visibility, closing distance before NATO gunners could employ their fire control systems to full effect. The assumption was that American and West German crews, deprived of natural light, would rely on image intensifiers that washed out in fog, struggled against smoke, and degraded sharply in moonless conditions. If those assumptions failed, everything built on top of them unraveled. Field simulations produced unsettling numbers. If a tank could detect a vehicle-sized heat source at several kilometers, and if its fire control system maintained stability at those distances, then defensive positions could engage maneuvering columns long before Soviet units crossed their own planned firing lines. The concept of approach under cover of darkness, central to Warsaw Pact operational art since the 1960s, lost its protective value. Darkness would no longer be a cloak. It would become neutral terrain. As evaluators examined more reconnaissance notes, certain tactical patterns stood out. When Soviet patrols illuminated terrain with their active infrared lamps, NATO tanks did not simply react quickly. They reacted with alignment that suggested direct sighting, not mere detection. Soviet officers knew that the infrared lamps produced energy in wavelengths invisible to unaided human eyes. Normally, only tanks equipped with compatible conversion devices could view the reflected beams. Those devices had limitations: blooming, flare, and heavy dependence on atmospheric clarity. But NATO tanks acted as if the invisible beams were perfectly obvious, even when humidity and condensation should have rendered the lamps nearly useless. If American crews were tracking these emissions directly, it implied a sensor that required no external illumination at all. The doctrinal implications were severe. Smoke, one of the most relied upon defensive tools in Soviet training, would no longer guarantee concealment if the enemy viewed the world in a spectrum unaffected by obscurance. Acoustic detection systems, occasionally tested on reconnaissance vehicles, offered no countermeasure. Even camouflage patterns optimized for optical disruption provided little value against a system that measured heat instead of shape or color. In confidential briefings, senior officers admitted that a thermal sight, if truly deployed on a fleet scale, would allow a defending force to establish fire superiority during the most critical phase of any armored engagement: the opening minutes. By the time a massed assault closed the distance, the spearhead might already be compromised. As these assessments circulated, a new urgency emerged within design bureaus and technical institutes. They needed answers, and fast. Inside the Soviet design bureaus tasked with armored vehicle modernization, the emerging reports produced an atmosphere that mixed disbelief with apprehension. Engineers who had spent their careers refining active infrared systems struggled to accept that a fundamentally different sensing method might be operating on NATO armor. To them, the notion that an American tank, especially one built on a platform dating back to the late 1950s, could host a ruggedized thermal imager seemed improbable. The cooling requirements alone posed an engineering barrier that had defeated several Soviet research teams. Yet the field observations left little room for alternative explanations. To reconcile theory with reality, analysts began assembling a classified dossier focused entirely on American optical research. They combed technical translations, procurement documents, congressional authorization notes, and export restrictions. Gradually, a clearer picture emerged. The United States had spent the better part of a decade investing in cryogenically cooled infrared detectors, initially developed for aircraft-based navigation and surveillance. Parallel research projects pursued compact refrigeration systems designed for missile seekers and remote sensors. None of these programs specifically mentioned armored integration, but the technological threads connected cleanly enough to raise alarms. What unsettled Soviet planners most was not the existence of thermal imaging itself. They had long been aware of Western experimental work, but the possibility that the Americans had solved the durability problems that plagued every Soviet attempt to miniaturize such devices. If the Americans had produced a closed-cycle cooling unit that could withstand turret vibrations, dust, and temperature swings, then a tank equipped with that system could maintain sight under virtually any atmospheric condition. As intelligence officers deepened their analysis, they noticed something else. NATO training videos, though usually mundane, showed gunners performing identification drills at distances that did not match the expected limitations of starlight optics. In several clips, silhouettes were recognized and classified at ranges far beyond what Soviet image intensifiers could achieve, especially under low illumination. The videos were not intended to reveal sensitive technology, yet the consistency of the results hinted at an optical advantage far greater than previously assumed. By late 1983, internal assessments began describing a new operational reality. If NATO armor could reliably detect, classify, and engage targets at distance without external illumination, then Warsaw Pact forces would face fire before their own systems even registered a viable image. In the calculus of armored warfare, this shifted initiative decisively toward the defender. Mobility, mass, and shock, the pillars of Soviet armored doctrine, could be neutralized by a single technological leap. The question was no longer whether such a capability existed. It was how widespread it had become. By the mid-1980s, the implications of the technological gap had crystallized into operational doctrine debates within the highest echelons of Soviet armored command. Exercises that had once relied on darkness as a force multiplier were reevaluated. Unit commanders were instructed to limit active infrared use, to stagger movements unpredictably, and to avoid predictable corridors of approach. Yet, these measures were tactical stopgaps. The fundamental problem remained. NATO armor now operated on a sensory spectrum inaccessible to Soviet crews. The defender could observe without being observed, creating a battlefield transparency imbalance that no previous doctrine had accounted for. The consequences extended beyond tactical maneuvers to strategic planning. Red Army staff officers realized that the massed armored thrusts designed to penetrate NATO defenses could be met with preemptive destruction. Night attacks, once a cornerstone of offensive doctrine, risked immediate neutralization. Soviet engineers were ordered to explore countermeasures, including thermal masking, exhaust cooling, and alternative active deception techniques. Each solution faced limitations in cost, technical feasibility, and deployment speed, leaving large armored formations vulnerable for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, NATO crews continued their rigorous training regimen. Live-fire exercises emphasized long-range identification and engagement, reinforcing confidence in thermal systems. Artillery coordination and infantry integration ensured that any Soviet advance, even under cover of darkness or adverse weather, would encounter layered and accurate defensive fire. The M60, though technologically vintage in its base chassis, became the linchpin of this strategy. Its thermal sight transformed the tank into a precision observer, able to exploit environmental variables, fog, smoke, and darkness, rather than be hindered by them. The Cold War theater was shifting quietly but decisively. Soviet armor, once considered the overwhelming force in Europe, faced a threat that no increase in gun caliber, armor thickness, or numerical superiority could negate. Darkness, the traditional ally of doctrine and doctrine-driven confidence, had become a liability. The Warsaw Pact's armored offensive potential was no longer assured, and every night movement carried a risk previously unimagined. As these assessments were finalized, intelligence reports, technical evaluations, and training observations coalesced into a stark conclusion. The ability to see, detect, and engage targets in darkness at long range had reshaped the tactical battlefield. The M60, through a combination of sensor innovation and disciplined crew training, had rendered entire Soviet doctrines obsolete without a single large-scale confrontation. For viewers intrigued by the hidden histories of military technology and the doctrines that defined the Cold War, understanding innovations like these is crucial. If you want more deep dives into the weapons, strategies, and secrets that shaped modern warfare, make sure to like and subscribe, and join us as we explore the battlefield in ways history textbooks never could.